So, you've done the online autism quotient test and you're now wondering what your score actually means. Well, hang on to your seat because we're now about to take a deep dive into the hidden insights about autism that the autism quotient test score actually reveals. But warning, do not continue to watch this video if you are easily triggered or if you're particularly attached to your chosen autism theories, because we are about to shatter everything you thought you knew about autism and the diagnostic process. Hi there, Simon Winovich here. Everyone just calls me Simo. Welcome to the Ultimate Divergence Embracing Neurodiversity YouTube channel. Are you struggling with life on the autism spectrum? Are you open to or already engaged in spiritual practices? Do you feel disconnected from traditional therapeutic methods for treating autism? If so, then you're in the right place. So, step inside with me if you dare, and we'll begin showing you the path to ultimate divergence. The online Autism Spectrum Quotient test was developed by Simon Baron-Cohen and his team at the Cambridge Autism Research Centre in 2001. It's a self-administered questionnaire that assesses autism spectrum traits in adults. It's widely used in both clinical and research settings, and it enables individuals to evaluate their behaviours and preferences across a range of dimensions, providing a preliminary gauge of autism spectrum traits. Validated through numerous studies, the AQ serves as a reliable tool in both clinical diagnostics and academic research. It examines aspects such as social interaction, communication, imagination, attention to detail, and tolerance for change, helping bridge the gap between self-awareness and professional assessment. The AQ is a valuable preliminary screening tool in clinical settings and a standardised measure for research on autism spectrum traits across different populations. Its easy online accessibility promotes self-awareness and can lead to professional evaluation, highlighting its role in early identification and support for individuals with autism spectrum traits. The AQ test consists of 50 statements, and you're given a choice of the same 4 answers for each of the statements. Those answers are definitely agree, slightly disagree, and definitely disagree. All of the statements are to do with behaviour or personal preferences. For example, the first statement is, I prefer to do things with others rather than on my own. On completion of the test, you're given a score out of 50. So what does this score actually mean? So on the surface, what these scores are indicating is your likelihood of being diagnosed with autism if you choose to have a clinical assessment. Most non-autistic people score around 16 on average. A score of 26 or higher indicates that you may be diagnosed with autism if you choose to have a clinical assessment. And 80% of the people that actually do go on and have an assessment score a 32 or higher on the test. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and I'll begin showing you the hidden insights that these scores reveal about autism and the diagnostic process. So here we have our 0 to 50 score line for the AQ test, guys. Here at 16, that's where most non-autistics on average score, so the bulk of your world population will score around a 16. At 25, we have a 0% chance of being diagnosed with autistic. So 25 and below, 0% chance. At 26, we have a 24% chance of being diagnosed as autistic. At 27, we have a 40% chance. And at 28, we have a 52% chance. And this continues increasing as we move up the scale. Once we get to 32, we have an 80% chance. At 34, which is where I score, we have an 88% chance. And at 35, we have an 89% chance. At 40, it's 96%. At 44, it's 98%. And of course here at 50, it's 100%. Now, as some of you may have noticed, in the first increment from 25 to 26 we jumped 24%, but the next increment we only jumped 16% and then only 12%. And as we move up with each increment, that jump gets less and less, till up here we're only jumping 2% over 6 increments. And the reason for that is the only actual figures you get as far as percentage wise when you read about the AQ test online is the 0% at 25 and the 80% at 32. All the rest of these figures I've worked out for myself. So don't take them as definitive. I'm pretty sure they're pretty accurate, but I may have calculated wrong in some way. So how I've done this is that from 26 to 32 we have an 80% rise, so across 6 increments, so there's only 6 increments. Then from 32 to 50, which is 18 increments, we have a 20% rise. So I don't know if any of you guys have done drawing with programs on the computer where you create a line and then you use Bezier handles to create a curve. You just pull on these little handles and you can create whatever curves you want. Well, that's all I did with this. I just, because of that, I knew that point and I assumed that point at 100, and then I just created the Bezier curve that allowed me to plot these other points. So as I said, don't take it as definitive, but for the purposes of this demonstration they will be close enough. And all you really need to know is that with each increment you move up the scale, your chances of being diagnosed as autistic increases steadily. So guys, if you're liking what you see so far in this video, hit that subscribe button, give that notification bell a bit of a nudge so you'll know when my next video comes out. Give us a like because you help out my channel, and feel free to leave a comment below this video because your feedback is invaluable to me. So on the surface, the AQ test is considered to be only a measurement of autistic traits, and it is not to be considered as definitive in any way. On completion of the test, depending upon your score, it is recommended that you get a clinical assessment to know for sure if you're autistic or not. There is no definitive line in the AQ test where you can know that once you score over that line you are autistic for certain. So of course, depending on your score, getting a clinical assessment would be a logical next step, right? So one of the main criticisms of the AQ test is that it is a subjective self-assessment of your own behaviour. So the results are open to be distorted by your cognitive biases. Now, a subjective assessment is basically where the results are your opinion. Whereas with an objective assessment, such as in a blood pressure test, the results are definitive, where the readings on the blood pressure gauge are what your actual blood pressure is. Add on top of that, you also have the problem where when answering some of the statements, you land in between slightly agree and slightly disagree, where you feel neutral about the statement. So neither answer feels correct, but you have to choose one of those answers. And then add on top of that again, from day to day you may answer the statements differently depending on how you feel on that day and what's happened during the day. Some days you might slightly agree with the statement, some days you might slightly disagree with the statement. I've done the AQ test 4 times in the last 6 years. I've tried to space them far enough apart so that I fully forget the statements in the test before I do the next test. The first 3 times I scored a 34 and the last time I scored a 35. So I've been consistent across the whole 4 tests. I've never had a clinical assessment and I will never ever get one. After hearing everything I've said so far, you wouldn't be blamed for wondering why I would not want to get a clinical assessment to know for sure if I'm autistic or not. Well, I'm about to start revealing to you my main problems with the whole diagnostic process, and I'll show you the hidden insights that the AQ test reveals about autism and the diagnostic process. So this is your final warning. Beyond this point, I'm about to turn your whole world completely upside down regarding everything autism. And if you're not ready for that, just turn this video off and go and watch something else. A clinical assessment is considered far more comprehensive than the AQ test. Plus, it removes your subjective amateur self-assessment of behaviour from the equation. A clinical assessment is carried out exclusively by highly trained professionals. But herein lies the problem. A clinical assessment still relies exclusively upon the subjective observation and assessment of behaviour, and it can be argued that it is open to even more subjectivity than the AQ test. With the AQ test, you're only dealing with one person's subjectivity, yourself, whereas with the clinical assessment, you're dealing with subjectivity from multiple sources. Firstly, we're dealing with the subjective assessment of behaviour, collected from the parent or primary caregiver of the assessed individual, which is then subjectively assessed by the clinician. So not only are our results being distorted by the cognitive biases of the parent or primary caregiver, but they're also being distorted by the cognitive biases of the clinician. Now, in the case of an adult assessment, this information can be collected through interviewing other close family members or family friends. Now, we also have to consider that there's not only one clinician, but a whole team of them, whose every individual can be distorting the results through their own cognitive biases. But surely I hear you ask, these being professionals, they would be immune from cognitive bias. Well, the truth is nobody is immune from cognitive bias, and it can be argued that clinicians are even more susceptible, and there are two famous studies that illustrate this. So the first experiment was conducted by David Rosenham in the early 1970s. He and 8 of his team members individually went and saw different psychiatrists and pretended to be having auditory hallucinations. They were hearing voices. Now all 9 of them were committed as being schizophrenic, with one being committed as being bipolar. Once they were admitted to the mental health facility, they stopped pretending that they were hearing voices and tried to convince the staff to let them out by telling them who they were and what they were actually doing. Well, they couldn't get out. The staff wouldn't believe them. Their average stay was 19 days, and one person had to stay 54 days before being let out. So how is it that these highly trained mental health professionals couldn't work out that these people didn't have this disorder? If the diagnostic process is so precise, it should be able to tell whether you have a disorder or you don't have a disorder. You should not be able to fake having it and be told that you have it. Well, the simple reason why this happens is because the diagnostic process is not precise at all. It is full of subjectivity, and subjectivity is an opinion. When you are diagnosed with a disorder or not, it is just the clinician's opinion that you have that disorder or not. There is no rock-hard, concrete, without a doubt, conclusive evidence that you have that disorder or not. It is just all subjectivity, and it is all just their opinion. The second experiment was carried out by psychologists Abel and Langer. A video of a man being interviewed was showed to 2 groups of psychiatrists. One group of psychiatrists was traditionally trained, and the other group was specifically trained against the use of mental health labels. Now, when they were told that the man being interviewed was a job applicant, both groups tended to see the man as being well adjusted. Whereas when they were told that the man being interviewed was a patient, the group specifically trained against the use of labels continued to see the man as being well adjusted, whereas the traditionally trained group of psychiatrists tended to see the man as having serious psychological problems. Now, both these experiments clearly show a clinician's susceptibility to cognitive biases and distortions in their subjective assessments of behaviour. The high rates of misdiagnosis in the mental health establishment also clearly illustrate this in a startling way. So depending upon which websites you go to, you're going to get different misdiagnosis rates. But here's some of the ones I found. For schizoaffective disorder, 75% misdiagnosis rate. For major depressive disorder, 55%. For schizophrenia, 24%. For bipolar, 93%. For panic disorder, 86%. For general anxiety disorder, 71%. Social anxiety disorder, 98%. For autism, for children, 30% misdiagnosis rate. For women, an 80% misdiagnosis rate. Now, I couldn't find anything specific for men, but all they say is that men have a less misdiagnosis rate than women. So you may be looking 50, 60%, 70% for men. For ADHD, 20% misdiagnosis rates, and I've actually seen places where that's much higher. So if you were a mechanic and you had misdiagnosis rates like this on car faults, you'd be out of business before you know it. So how do these people get away with this? How can you be allowed to have misdiagnosis rates of 98% for social anxiety disorder? So you've got millions of people running around out there believing they have disorders that they don't have. This is just, it's completely out of control. How do they get away with this? So because clinical assessment relies exclusively upon the subjective observation and interpretation of behaviour, you cannot exclude subjectivity and cognitive biases from influencing the assessment results. There are no reliable biomarkers for autism. You cannot take a physical test of any kind that will conclusively show you that you have autism or not. At the moment, there is this misconception overtaking the world that autism is genetically caused. Now, this has not been conclusively proven in any way, shape or form. Yet you still have many so-called reputable authority websites emphatically stating autism is genetically caused. And this is being further repeated by popular autistic YouTube influencers. Now, the NIMH, or National Institute of Mental Health, is a sub-department of the National Institute of Health, or NIH, which is the largest medical research group in the world. So if autism is genetically caused, I should be able to go to their website and it will emphatically state autism is genetically caused. However, when I go to their site and look under the heading, what are the causes and risk factors for ASD, the first sentence states, researchers don't know the primary cause of ASD, but studies suggest that a person's genes can act together with aspects of their environment in ways that lead to autism. So the sentence clearly states that they do not know what causes autism and that studies only suggest that genetics may interact with the environment to cause autism. I mean, I can suggest that I can fly. Doesn't mean I can do so. Yet we have the whole world beginning to believe that autism is genetically caused. So what does all this have to do with the AQ test? Well, as we've already established, the clinical assessment is considered to be far more comprehensive than the AQ test. But unlike the AQ test, which does not have a definitive line anywhere, where you know once you score over that you are autistic for sure, the clinical assessment, whatever scale they are using, has to have a definitive line somewhere where once you score over that line you are considered to be autistic. When you leave that clinic, they tell you if you're autistic or not. So they don't say to you, yeah, there's an 80% chance you're autistic, or there's a 65% chance you're autistic, or we're not really sure if you're autistic. They definitively tell you whether you are or you aren't. So there has to be a line existing somewhere. So I don't know exactly what scale they are using in a clinical assessment. It could be 0 to 500, 0 to 5,000, who knows. You can jump online and find out the assessment criteria. It's quite a list, but the actual scoring, I can't find it. So it'll be the same as the AQ test in that all they're doing is assessing behaviours. It's just that there's a lot more statements they'll be assessing against, but it'll still be a like multiple choice scoring system where, however it is, whether it's be definitely agree, slightly disagree, or definitely disagree, I'm sure theirs has got a few more boxes in it, but they're still just ticking boxes, and at the end of the scoring, they add it all up, and then you score over wherever the designated line is. So just to keep things simple, we will just use the 0 to 50 scale, and as far as determining where the line is, I did come across a popular YouTube influencer, autistic YouTube influencer, and he claimed that the line was between 31 and 32. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that anywhere. I don't know where he got that from, but for the purposes of this demonstration, that's the line we will use. So this area between 32 and 50 is considered to be the autism spectrum. Once you score a 32 or over, it is considered that you have this entity inside of you called autism that the general population does not. Now that is a fabricated illusion. It's a total lie. It's absolute bullshit. Because this line here does not exist in nature. There is no reliable biomarkers that have been identified that are consistent across all cases of autism. If they were, you'd be able to go in and get some sort of physical test where they could say conclusively, yes, you have autism. But no, they're not. So without those biomarkers, they cannot prove that this line even exists, let alone where it actually is. This line does not exist as a physically tangible entity. It only exists as a perception-based entity in the minds of the people who create the DSM. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, is considered to be the psychiatric Bible of mental disorders. The latest edition, the DSM-5, includes all of the clinical assessment criteria for all of the included disorders. Now, the process of determining what assessment criteria goes into the DSM is open to the same level of subjectivity as the assessment process itself. The contents of the DSM is determined through a comprehensive and collaborative process that involves mental health professionals from all around the world who examine the latest research findings and clinical evidence to determine which disorders to include, modify, or take out. They also determine which behaviours to include with each disorder and the assessment criteria used to evaluate those behaviours. So in spite of all the research that's been carried out on autism, they still have no absolute proof that autism exists as a physically tangible entity that a person can possess within themselves. Once you strip out all the theories and all the expert opinions, all that you're left with is that it's something that somehow affects the early developmental stages. Everything else is just an unproven theory. They still have no real idea what it actually is or what causes it. So as far as clinical evidence goes, evidence is not proof. Evidence is just a clue that something may be true, whereas proof is absolutely, conclusively definitive that that thing is true. Now, regardless of how much supporting evidence they claim a theory has, without conclusive proof, that theory can be overturned at any time. Psychiatry has got it wrong many times in the past, so it stands to reason they're highly likely to be getting it wrong in many areas at present, and will continue to get it wrong in many areas in the future. Everything the experts put in the DSM is just their latest theories and their expert professional opinion on what the latest research findings and clinical evidence suggests. Regardless of how expert an opinion is still just a guess. It's estimated that up to 10% of the people in US prisons are actually innocent, and that equates to 240,000 people. They've arrived at this statistic through the use of advanced DNA testing to prove the innocence of previously convicted people. Now, these people were convicted at the time because there was strong supporting evidence to suggest their guilt. And in over half of these cases of wrongful conviction, expert testimony played a major role in causing this outcome. So strong supporting evidence and expert testimony or opinion does not equate to definitive, unquestionable proof that something is so. So even with strong supporting evidence and professional opinion, it's still highly likely that they can be completely wrong. Now, Simon Baron-Cohen, the guy who invented the Autism Quotient test, also invented the empathizing quotient test and the systemizing quotient test. It was his theory that there are two types of cognitive styles, the empathizing cognitive style and the systemizing cognitive style, and that everybody had a mixture of the two. Those with a predominantly empathizing cognitive style navigate their way through life using emotion and empathy, whereas those with the systemizing cognitive style navigate their way through life through pattern recognition and the systems that those patterns lead to. So through his 3 quotient tests, he found that those considered to be autistic tended to have a predominantly systemizing cognitive style, and those considered to be part of the general population tended to have a predominantly empathizing cognitive style. So even though there's a separate systemizing quotient test and an empathizing quotient test, if you delve beneath the surface of the autism quotient test, you find that it's measuring the ratio of empathizing to systemizing cognitive styles, because that's what the whole test was based upon. It was based upon Simon Baron-Cohen's theory that there are 2 cognitive styles, empathizing and systemizing, and then we all have a mixture of the both. So through his quotient test, he found that those that are considered to be autistic tend to have a predominantly systemizing cognitive style, and those down here in the general population tend to have a predominantly empathizing cognitive style. So if we consider that 0 is 100% empathizing and 50 is 100% systemizing, every increment in between is a ratio of the 2, is measuring the ratio of the 2. So now these figures I'm about to put out, they're rectally extracted, so don't take them as definitive. I don't know exactly how he's scoring it, but intuitively I'd say my figures will be pretty close, and they're close enough for the purposes of this demonstration. So as you move up with each increment, you're increasing your systemizing by 2% and reducing your empathizing by 2%. So for example, at 1 here you'd have 98% empathizing and 2% systemizing, and so forth as you move up the scale. Now once you get to 16, where the bulk of the world population exists around, you would have a 32% systemizing and 68% empathizing cognitive style. So the bulk of the world population has around a 2/3 empathizing and 1/3 systemizing cognitive style. Once you get up here to 25, you have a 50-50, half and half cognitive style. Now at 26, an interesting correlation happens here. At 26 is where they designate is the first score where you begin to have the potential to be diagnosed with autism if you choose to have a clinical assessment. At 26, you have a 24% chance of being diagnosed with autism. But this is also the point where you first begin to have a predominantly systemizing cognitive style. So here you have, at 26, you have a 52% systemizing and 48% empathizing. Now, people who have a predominantly empathizing cognitive style, they navigate through life using empathy and emotion. Whereas people who have a predominantly systemizing cognitive style, we navigate through life through pattern recognition and the systems that those patterns lead to. So we once you cross this line, you have to operate in the world completely differently to those down here. So it's quite interesting that once you cross that, once you become predominantly systemizing, you start getting the potential to be diagnosed as autistic. So at 31, you have a 62% systemizing and 38% empathizing. And then at 32, it's 64% systemizing and 36% empathizing. Now, the mental health establishment would have you believe that this person here at 32 has something inside of them that this person at 31 does not. And that is absolute crap, because this line does not exist in nature. And this idea that this spectrum only exists up here is again another illusion. Once you take that line away, what you have is a spectrum of behaviour that spans the whole population, because there are no behaviours that autistic people display that are not found in the general population. The whole clinical assessment is measuring your behaviour. It's assessing your behaviours, and they are just scoring you somewhere on this scale. So the difference between 31 and 32 is just a different in degree of behaviour. So the idea that the person at 32 has something inside of them that the person at 31 does not is a complete fabrication. The only difference between 32 and 31 is that 32 has a slightly more intense version of what 31 has, and 31 has a slightly more intense version of what 30 has, and so forth down the line. And the same upper line, 33 has only a slightly more intense version than what the person at 32 has. So they have not discovered autism and the autism spectrum, they've created it. All they've done is this spectrum of behaviour that spans the whole population. All they've done is just draw this line across here, segregate that end and call that autism, and said that it is a disorder. So all they are is discriminated against people that have a higher ratio of systemizing to empathizing. And because the world has been built for the bulk of the population, which is mainly empathizing, once you become predominantly systemizing, you start having difficulties navigating through a world built for empathizing. So these challenges and difficulties are what they focus upon, and say that because of these challenges and difficulties, you therefore must have something broken inside of you that we need to fix. The term autism was first used in 1911 to describe a subset of schizophrenia. It wasn't used in the context that it is today until 1943, when a guy called Leo Kanner diagnosed the first person with autism as being a separate disorder to that of schizophrenia. He came to the conclusion that autism was separate to schizophrenia through his subjective observations of behaviour in children that displayed a powerful desire for aloneness and an obsessive insistence on persistent sameness. So through his subjective observations of behaviour, filtered through the distortions of his cognitive biases, he came to the opinion that these children had an entity inside of them that he chose to see and label as a disorder. And that is how autism as the disorder we know it today came into existence. Autism as a disorder wasn't discovered. Autism as a disorder was created in the mind of Leo Kanner. So Kanner's subjective opinion that these children had a disorder is based upon the myth of normal behaviour. And the myth of normal behaviour originates from the idea of that which is more common must therefore be normal. So Kanner determined that the behaviour in these children was so vastly different to that of what he considered to be normal behaviour in children, their behaviour must therefore be not normal and therefore a disorder. So in his mind, he created the idea that these children were somehow broken inside and therefore needed fixing. All of this based upon no biological evidence whatsoever, only upon his subjective observations of behaviour. So the children that Leo Kanner was studying, they would have scored up around here somewhere or above, because they would have been the ones that stood out in society. They would have been the ones they noticed first, and they were the ones that they focused their attention on and began studying. So Leo Kanner himself, he probably was down around here somewhere, because that's where the bulk of the population scores. So him being down here somewhere, looking up here at these children, they would have looked vastly different to him, almost alien-like. So according to the standard that Leo Kanner set as far as what autism was, which was just a couple of identified behaviours, only those people that would have scored above this line would have been considered autistic in those days. So initially Leo Kanner only identified two main behaviours, and that was the powerful desire for aloneness and the desire for sameness and everything. But as they continued to study these children, they noticed more and more behaviours, and they added those behaviours to the identity of what they saw as autism. Now, if they're just studying these children up here at first, and they noticed behaviours in these children, well, once they turned around and looked at these children down here, they would have noticed some of the same behaviours in them as well, because there's only a 2% difference in cognitive style in these children. So they would have said, oh, well, no, the line's not here, the line's down here. So they would have captured a larger group of these children. But again, the same thing would have happened. The behaviours they were observing in these children, when they turned around, they would have also seen those behaviours in these ones. So again, they said, oh, okay, we've better move the line. And this has kept happening over the years until the line is where it is today. And that's not going to stop, because they're not up against a hard stop. That line does not exist in nature. That line exists where they say it exists. The next time they get there and review the DSM and sit around and have their discussion, debate, argue back and forth, eventually they'll get to the point where they say, okay, we've noticed all these new behaviours which we need to include with the disorder, so that means we can't leave the line there anymore, we have to move the line down here. And that's not going to stop. And all they're doing every time they move that line is they're capturing more and more people with a predominantly systemising cognitive style. So if you were to draw a population curve, it would look something like this. You'd start here at 0, because it'd be very rare to find someone who is 100% empathising, if they exist at all. And then it'd come up here to 16, where it would peak, because that's where the bulk of the population scores around 16. And then it would drop off down here to 0 again, because again, it would be very rare to find someone who's 100% systemising, if at all. So effectively what they're doing every time they move this line is they're grabbing a greater and greater chunk of the general population. Because when the line was here, it was only those considered up there that had a disorder, whereas those down here were considered to be part of the general population and normal. And each time they move that line, they grab another chunk of the general population and say, yeah, we told you yesterday you were normal, but we decide you're not anymore, and we're going to say that you've got a disorder. And every increment, they just grab another chunk, and each chunk is larger than the previous chunk because of this population curve. So that's not stopping. And this is one of the major criticisms of psychiatry, is the over-pathologisation of normal behaviours, where a child now says has ODD, which is oppositional defiance disorder, and a person who grieves for too many days now has some sort of excessive grief disorder. They're just totally out of control. So for them to maintain the illusion that these people up here are somehow different to these people down here, and that those people have an entity inside of them that these people do not, to keep that illusion going, you have to make this group of people in here disappear. Because as long as you're only comparing people from down here to these people up here, you're still maintaining that sense of gap, that there is something vastly different about those people than these people. There's this gap in between them. But the moment you compare someone at 31 to 32, that illusion disappears, and you realise that this line is bullshit, and that this group of people as being separate doesn't exist. They are not separate at all. They are just part of this. They are just the extreme end of one continuous spectrum that spans the whole population. So how do you make that group of people disappear? We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people. Well, it's quite simple really. All you do is you call that group of people ADHD. And now you can no longer compare these people to these people, because as they will tell you, these people, ADHD is not part of the autism spectrum. They do share a lot of similar behaviours, but they are something completely different. They then say that you have to be careful when diagnosing, because they are so similar that you can give a misdiagnosis. So now you can no longer compare these people to these people, and you're now maintaining that illusion because you can only compare these people down here to these people up here. Now eventually the same thing will happen down here. They'll need to hide this group of people, so you can't compare that to that, and then all they'll do is just call that another disorder, and it'll just keep going. So all they've effectively done by creating this disorder that they call autism is they've segregated this part of the population that has a predominantly systemising cognitive style of 64% and above, and they have determined that these people, because of that, are somehow broken inside and need fixing in some way. So the bulk of the world population has a predominantly empathising cognitive style. So from 25 down to 0 here, you're probably looking at least 80% of the world's population has a predominantly empathising cognitive style. Now that means that the world, that as we know it, has been basically built for people with the predominantly empathising cognitive style. Once you move over this point and start to become predominantly systemising cognitive style, you now have to navigate the world through a completely different set of eyes, so to speak. So the further you move up here, the more and more difficulty you have trying to operate in a world built for empathising while you have a systemising cognitive style. So this is part of what they've done, is the further you move up this scale, the more and more difficulty you have. So therefore they decide that these difficulties that you're having is an indication that you are somehow broken inside, because you can't operate in the world like the rest of the people, and they therefore decided that you need to be fixed, and ever since that point they've been studying us all like lab rats. So there you have it guys, the AQ test is much more than just a simple assessment of autism spectrum traits. Once you understand the theory of systemising and empathising cognitive styles that underpins the AQ test, it opens a window into hidden insights about autism and the diagnostic process that you would never have even realised existed. So the final point I want to make guys is that, to me, for a theory of autism to be a valid one, it must explain both the challenges as well as the exceptional abilities that many autistics display. And to me, Simon Baron-Cohen's theory of systemising and empathising cognitive styles goes a long way to explaining those. If everything they know about autism is just theories, well, why not choose theories that empower us rather than imprison us? The mental health establishment's current model of autism is an imprisoning one. It tells us that we have a disorder and that we are somehow broken inside and need fixing. So I'll post a link below this video in the description guys to my blog post explaining my ultimate divergence theory of autism. Unlike the mental health establishment's model of autism, mine is an empowering one. So check it out, it'll open your eyes. There's also a link to my first YouTube video explaining all my reasons why I'll never ever get a clinical diagnosis, and there's also a link down there to my Facebook page where I keep you up to date with my latest blog posts and my latest YouTube videos, and also everything else neurodivergent. So to all you guys that have stuck with me until the end of this video, you're absolute legends. Until next time, I'll catch you later.